What if Elvis made a stripped down 90s comeback record? Find out on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name is Morgan Brown, and for the last few months I've been making a series of videos that I call What If videos. Each week I take a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe scenario in which a decision that someone's made or a different set of circumstances cause that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and, using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand, record my own backing track to it in order to realise this alternative universe version of the song. So this week, vaguely in keeping with October's spooky theme, I took on the song You're the Devil in Disguise by Elvis Presley, and I reimagined it as a version that Elvis might have recorded had he lived into the 90s and made a comeback record in the manner of Johnny Cash's American Recordings series. So if you haven't heard that yet, here's a little excerpt.
You look like an angel, walk like an angel, talk like an angel, but I got mine. You're the devil in disguise. Oh yes you are.
It's funny really, I grew up with a lot of early rock and roll music in my life, and yet I never really became an Elvis fan. I think as quite a small child my dad introduced me to Chuck Berry, so from the first I'd really kind of always considered Chuck Berry to be my king of rock and roll. I was always into the guitar, and he's very much the definitive rock and roll guitarist. I started listening to other bits and bobs and somehow just never really latched onto Elvis the same way as I did the likes of Buddy Holly or Eddie Cochran. Buddy Holly and Eddie Cochran, both terrific songwriters as well as performers. Gene Vincent was very much sort of moulded after Elvis, but somehow always seemed harder edged. Like Jerry Lee Lewis definitely had a real edge of danger, as well as being an incredible instrumentalist. And then obviously performers like Little Richard. I mean, there's a very good case for him being the true kind of king of rock and roll. I loved Fats Domino as well. So I really got into the whole early rock and roll scene, from rockabilly to R&B that edges into rock and roll, and yet never really grasped onto Elvis. I think part of it is that a lot of people who weren't around at the time grow up with this image of Elvis refracted through a lens of tribute acts and people kind of doing these campy throwbacks to late era Vegas Elvis. And if you're looking for sort of raw rock and roll, there are other people you're going to go to before someone in this kind of rhinestone jumpsuit doing these corny stage moves that you see parodied. You don't necessarily even see the actual footage of Elvis in those shows. So it wasn't really until quite a few years later that I properly got into him. Obviously, there were odd songs that I heard and loved. That's All Right Mama, Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, and some of the later stuff as well I enjoyed. But it was only really quite a few years later, when I'd become a much wider ranging kind of pop fan, that I went back and gave him a bit more of a chance and found a lot more stuff that I enjoyed, including things from those Vegas years. I think I wrote a lot of that stuff off as overblown showbizy nonsense, and I think a lot of rock fans have a bit of a problem with anything getting too showbiz. And certainly it's miles away from hungry young kind of rocker that you see in all the kind of early footage, but still some great records that came out of that era, like fantastic arrangements as well. He always had an incredible band. And when you see footage of the performances from kind of the Vegas years, when he was obviously still actually enjoying himself, there's some terrific performances in there too. To write that whole era off would be an absolute crime. I do think it's a shame that his career was so controlled by Colonel Tom Parker, to the point where I think a lot of that early rock and roll spirit was forced out of his music quite early on. And then he was prevented from properly touring ever. And you just get the impression that his career was very much shoehorned into this one ideal that Colonel Tom had never really got to kind of explore broader possibilities of what a career in music could have been. And also his acting as well. I mean, I know he definitely had an interest in pursuing serious acting roles, and instead ended up making this series of of musicals, which, started off pretty good. I've seen a few. They're the kind of thing that used to be on British daytime TV in the summer holidays when I was a kid. And I feel like I've seen Jailhouse Rock, and that was pretty good. GI Blues, maybe. But they definitely get more formulaic and campier. The songs get worse as they go along. And it's kind of a pity that he never really got to explore that side of his career more fully as well. I think the fact that his career was limited in this way has occasionally led me to just sort of daydream about these other possibilities. What could have happened if he hadn't been shackled to this very strict idea that the Colonel had for his career? And that's kind of the instinct that led me to make this week's video. Just to explain this week's alternative universe scenario, I was speculating about an alternative universe in which, rather than tragically passing away back in 1977, instead of actually being killed by the heart attack, Elvis just has a massive health scare from that. This causes him to retreat from the limelight, abandon his career in showbiz, seemingly forever. People keep trying to reach out to him with lucrative offers to do different things. No comeback from him at all. He's just vanished from public view. And it seems, to all intents and purposes, that the world's never going to hear from him again. But then it's the mid-90s. Johnny Cash, after years in the wilderness, making increasingly generic and unsuccessful records through the 80s, makes this comeback with the first volume of the American recording series produced by Rubin. And obviously his career is completely rejuvenated. And then Johnny personally reaches out to his old friend Elvis to say, hey, I've just done this. It's completely turned my life and my career around. Why don't you come in? We can make your own American Recordings album and just see what it does for you. And finally, this brings Elvis back out of the shadows to come and make some new music. I could really imagine how, with the musical background that he had, Elvis could have really knocked it out of the park on something like that. The American Recording series is a really interesting move for Johnny Cash at a time when he could still pack people in on the live circuit, but as a recording artist, he was pretty much washed up. At the time, country music had changed to something almost completely unrecognizable from what it had been when Johnny Cash was starting back in the 50s. Each generation of Nashville has its own sound that it pushes to the exclusion of pretty much everything else. And I guess in the 90s, the prevailing sound was your kind of Garth Brooks and Shania Twain, these kind of big production, almost pop rock sounding stuff that was very far removed from anything rootsy. But at the same time, through the 80s and into the 90s, you have the development of, I guess, what we now know as Americana. Americana is a funny term, really. It's just really a marketing term, but it kind of served a dual purpose in that it gave Nashville a way to separate what they were packaging as country music from anything that didn't fit that mold. So something else comes out that kind of sounds like country, but not like the country that Nashville is currently pushing to the mass market. They can say, oh, that's not country, that's Americana. And at the same time, by having this music that sounds like different aspects of classic country and folk, but isn't branded as country, made it more palatable and acceptable to people who didn't come from that background. So rock fans, punks, people who'd generally be embarrassed to go into a record shop and pick up a country record with all the stigma that might go with that. I guess you can trace Americana back as a movement to the likes of Graham Parsons, who brought elements of traditional country music to West Coast rock audiences back in the 60s and into the 70s, both with the Byrds and the Flying Burrito Brothers and with Emmylou Harris and as a solo artist. And then also the outlaw country singers of the 70s, Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, those guys, through songwriters like Townes Van Zandt, Guy Clark, people who definitely come from a country tradition, but didn't really fit into that kind of Nashville mode, were very much marching to the beat of their own drum. And then in the 80s, you definitely get that punk influence coming in too. So you see bands like X and the Blasters, who combined elements of LA punk with rootsy country and rockabilly. Lone Justice with Maria McKee, who are fantastic. And one of my favorites, Blood on the Saddle, really underrated band, kind of combined roots country music, punk, and some quite kind of traditional Irish music stuff as well. And then going forward through that, you get the likes of Steve Earle, had many classic country elements, but would also mix it up with alternative rockers, toured with the Replacements. And then I guess he leads on to the likes of the Jayhawks, Uncle Tupelo, Wilco. And that's kind of where you get this Americana label, because all this stuff still kind of sounds like country music, but it's a million miles away from the guys in the big cowboy hats singing about their truck in front of an American flag. So when Rick Rubin steps in to produce Johnny Cash, it's kind of to this Americana market that he's pushing those records, and that really gives Johnny Cash a massive career boost, because all of a sudden people who are listening to alternative rock can go, oh yeah, I like Johnny Cash, I've always liked Johnny Cash. Whereas a few years earlier they would have probably been mortified to admit to that, even though they probably liked a bunch of those old records. He makes this great series of albums. Any kind of Nashville production gloss is completely gone. Pretty stripped down instrumentation, quite often provided by members of Tom Petty's Heartbreakers. Fairly stark, brooding atmosphere. Material that's a mixture of sometimes reworked versions of his old classics, I guess a few new songs in there too, Johnny Cashified versions of much more recent kind of alternative rock songs, and then sort of old folk songs and gospel songs, all turned into this kind of coherent whole. And it's really one of the most remarkable career turnarounds that anyone's ever managed in the history of popular music. And obviously after that you do see the likes of Neil Diamond did a similar thing. Glenn Campbell as well had a great late career flourish with a similar project. It did kind of pave the way for these sort of legacy artists who were still going strong, could still perform, but had long since fallen from critical grace, to artistically rehabilitate themselves. So I really thought, had Elvis survived, this would have been a great way for him to reclaim any credibility that he'd lost through all those years of fairly shoddy musicals and then Vegas residencies. So, You're the Devil in Disguise, if you're not familiar with it. I can't remember actually what year it came out, but it's from that early 60s period of Elvis's work, where there's still definitely a bit of rock and roll to the music he's making, but the edges have been sanded off. You'd probably call it more pop. There's the Jordanaires, nice syrupy harmonies, but there's still some great songs from that period, and I've always been a fan of this one. So the original, it's kind of major key, it's pretty upbeat, in spite of the fact that obviously Elvis is portraying this wronged protagonist who's been cheated on by this devilish girlfriend. So I thought, if this was reworked for an American Recordings style project, the first thing I need to do is just take the tempo right down. So I took the isolated vocal, not very well isolated from the original track, I must say. This one's pretty lo-fi, but it's the best I've got. So I've synced that up to the grid on GarageBand and then just took the tempo right down to a crawl. And normally at this stage I'd program the drums. I didn't want a full drum kit. I wanted to keep things sounding pretty sparse. And I also wanted that kind of really somber tone that you get with things like Johnny Cash's version of Hurt by Nine Inch Nails. So I kept the percussion to just bass drum. All the orchestral instruments, I should say, I took from the Spitfire Audio, BBC SO, Discovery Pack, which I use pretty much every week on these things. It's great free plugin. So I took the orchestral bass drum from that and a tambourine, and that's all the percussion there is in the whole thing. I decided to continue with the somber tone. I needed to overhaul the chord sequence as well, because, as I say, the original, it's kind of major key, fairly standard pop chord changes. So I moved the whole thing into the relative minor, so it sounds really gloomy, which is exactly what I wanted. I didn't want to use electric bass, so I, again, using that orchestral plugin, I just took double bass sound from there, pizzicato double bass, and just put a very minimal bass line on there. And then I figured the next thing was acoustic guitars. We're going for Americana, you want some acoustic guitar on there. There's like a suggestion of some kind of like folky roots. So I did 2 acoustic guitar tracks, one in each side of the stereo, playing different voicings of the same chords. And then I wanted the sound to build from a really sparse beginning to something a bit fuller and more emotive as the song goes on. So we just add instruments as the song continues. So a cello comes in first, I think, and then I added a viola, and a piano comes in. did throw in a little bit of electric guitar just to the instrumental section. Ideally, I would have liked to use a 12 string, but I don't have one, or at least not one that's currently functional. I've got an ongoing DIY project, but it's some way from completion. So I just double tracked an electric guitar and on 2 different octaves to get a similar effect. So yeah, we have this kind of emotional sweep of a song going from a really stark beginning to this tumultuous ending, and hopefully it does get a bit of the feel of some of the darker bits of those Johnny Cash records. For the video that went along with it, there are loads of archive home movies of Elvis kicking around on the internet. So I decided to do a thing similar to the Hurt video again, where you have a juxtaposition of lots of footage of young Elvis being carefree, and then some more pensive looking footage of him as an older man, both running in slow motion, just played off against each other to suggest a kind of rueful looking back. It doesn't really necessarily tie in with the theme of the song, but I think it kind of rings true with the emotional tone that I was going for in the song. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I think it came out pretty well and cast the song in a whole new light. Hopefully gives a reasonable idea of how sort of American recordings Elvis might have sounded. Hopefully still sounds respectful to the king as well. I certainly didn't want to upset anyone by messing around with his legacy. But yeah, do let me know what you think in the comments. Also, if there's anything else you'd like me to try, any artists you'd like me to take a look at, any songs you'd like me to take on, or any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, please also drop me a comment, let me know. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and check out my other videos too. I'll pop a link down in the description. And that's all from me for this week. So until next time, see you later.